Hey everyone, we are back for Bible in a Year. I am so excited to invite you to join us as we go through this. Maybe you've been going through Leviticus and you found it to be difficult. I am hang in there. We just got through it. We're starting into Numbers, and then Leviticus and Numbers. It can be challenging because it's a lot of repetition and some of the things that you read, but it's really setting the stage for the things that the religious leaders in the time of Jesus were struggling with, kind of the difficulty in the behavior of the people in the days of the Israelites later on when the kingdoms were divided, and a lot of the law in which we're reading right now. Later, Hezekiah and some of the other kings would find, and then they would come back to it and say, we haven't been doing these things. We need to get back to the law. And these are the things that they were getting back to, were some of the things that we see here. You know, you can look at this and say, man, there's just so many laws in the Old Testament. I think in totality, there was about 600 and some laws in the Bible, over 600 laws. When you think of the United States, there are way more laws in this nation than we would say that they had in the land of Israel. And so when you think, man, this is a lot of law, in perspective, it wasn't as many as you think, and much of it had to do with our relationship with God and how we would interact with God. So we're going to start over in Leviticus 15. We're Leviticus 15 to Numbers chapter 3. And it was funny. We start off in the discharges causing uncleanliness. And I was sitting there thinking, what are the discharges? Essentially, some of these laws or things that were put in place because of not that you were unclean, but it also, there are some health issues that are a part of this as well. God wanted to protect them from some health issues. And he says later in Leviticus, when we come to the end of Leviticus, he says, if you obey me and make me your God, and if you will trust me in these laws, if you will do this, he goes, I will bless you. You will prosper. Essentially, he's saying, I'm not asking you to be obedient in Leviticus 26 when he brings this up. I'm not asking you to be obedient because I need a people to obey me like I'm some dictator God wanting people to follow and obey me. He says, I created you because I wanted to prosper you. It is God's will to prosper you. And he says, well, then what do we need to do, God? And he says, these are the things you need to do in order to prosper in the context in which you're living. And in their context, this law really helped them do that. And now, when you look at some of the diseases that were there, like we now know about germs. For years, they had no idea about germs. They had no idea about uncleanliness, about any of that stuff. And they start talking about it when talking about, through Leviticus. Now, maybe you noticed, but in Leviticus, we start getting into some pretty touchy things, and people who've made bold statements about certain behaviors in our culture. There are some verses that confront those statements or beliefs or comments that people have made. But go to Leviticus 16. I want to show you something. It refers to the two goats, and it says that you're to bring two goats, and you're to cast lots between the two goats. In verse 8, so one is to be sacrificed, and the other is to be called what is a scapegoat. And it's an interesting thing. Most people, you're just going to read right past it. What's interesting about the scapegoat is literally they would walk up to the goat and they would slap the goat and they would strike the goat. Now, I know this sounds pretty abusive to those living in the world we're living in right now, where animal cruelty is at a premium. But in this day, they would sacrifice one goat and the other goat, they would tie their sin to it, and they would slap the goat, and then there would be someone assigned to take the goat out into the wilderness, and then the goat would be hit and sent away. And the reason it's called a scapegoat is essentially one gave its life while the other one went free. So one goat would be the scapegoat, and we use that term all the time, is the scapegoat. Who's the scapegoat that will carry away they're the ones we're going to blame for that. This was a sacrifice of the scapegoat. That goat would take the blame. So one was sacrificed and one would take the guilt or the shame or the effects of that. Why is that important? Jesus was both. He was the sacrifice goat and he was the scapegoat. He was beaten, he was bruised at the cross, and essentially he took the guilt and shame and condemnation for the people on himself, and he became that. When he was being flogged and beaten, it was almost as though he was the scapegoat being released, so that our sins would be released. It's a great picture of what would happen later on, and and something for us to look at. If you have any questions, just bring them up. We'll go over them. Otherwise, we'll go over to, let's go over to 14. In chapter 17, we can look at verse 14. It talks about the life of every creature is in its blood. And it tells us that they should not drink blood, which is something that the pagans did much of, because they believed life was in the blood as well. They believed if they drank the blood that it would give them life, that it would do things for them. They believed blood was an important thing, although they didn't know why. We believe the blood of Jesus is important. That's why we plead the blood of Jesus to cover us and to protect us, because there's life in the blood. Jesus shed his blood for us. It's a statement you'll hear a lot of by Christians. He shed his blood for us. What he was doing was giving us life, and it's a life that you can practically experience when you're with God and when you come to Christ and you give your life to Christ. And then there's a whole discourse there on the blood and the life that's in every creature, that we aren't to drink the blood of an animal, but the blood should be drained out. And that doesn't mean you shouldn't eat something medium rare. It just means you shouldn't be drinking blood. It's not something that I know there are people who do blood sausage and they love it. Blood isn't. It's just not what God. It's just not healthy for you. Go over to Leviticus 18, and we'll get into something a little more offensive. Because you know how much we just love that. Leviticus 18 is talking about some behavior that is, that physical behavior, immorality, dealing with activities that they were involved with. Now, it's important to remember, all of these Israelites, for the most part that we know of, all of them except for maybe a few, if that, were raised in Egypt. They were raised around paganism. They were raised within a culture of pagan gods. And so the practices, the laws of the land, the cultural practices, the festivities, the holidays that were celebrated were not celebrated as unto the Lord. Remember, when they were in Egypt, there wasn't Passover, there wasn't Pentecost, and there wasn't the festival of booths or the trumpets or tabernacles, some would call them. There were no feasts. Israel had no feasts. So if they were going to celebrate holidays, they were celebrating the holidays of the land, and so that was an important thing for every person, is look forward to holidays, and they were celebrating the holidays of the land. So then he comes and he says this in verse 3 of chapter 18. He says, "You must not do as they do in Egypt, nor follow the ways of Canaan." What God was telling him is, what we're doing here is creating a different culture. whether it's Canaanite or Egyptian. The holidays may be different, but they're the same. The titles may be different, but they're the same. The gods may be different, but they're the same. And he's saying, I am the one true God, and I want you to worship me. And then he goes in, this is how you're going to do it. And he says, I want you to obey. He talks about incest. He talks about siblings involved with each other. He talks about unnatural relationships between people of the same gender. He talks about relationship with animals and that they're the involvement with animals. He talks about how we are to interact with the people and unbelievers in the land. And he even says that the land, if they don't obey, that even the land would be defiled and the land would be punished and the land would vomit them out of Israel just as it was vomiting Canaan out of Israel. This is an interesting thing because the land was God's land. The land of Canaan was God's land. It was set apart. It was set aside for God. And he was going to put his people in the land. And he said, if you're going to live in my land, then you need to obey the laws that I'm giving you. And essentially, this is what all of this was apart. He said, do not follow any of the detestable customs of the demonic culture. I want to talk about that a little bit too. There are some things in America that we're a part of and we don't want to escape. I mean, even the Quakers would not celebrate Christian. I think it was the Puritans actually, Christmas. The Puritans were the actual one that said, let's make this holiday a Christian holiday so that we can celebrate it. I think there are holidays that are very demonic, like Halloween, for instance, is an extremely demonic holiday. And when you read the law, it's there. When you read the churches in Revelation, you see this reoccurring theme that God does not want us participating in things that are honoring and worshiping demons. And there are practices that we do in our culture, activities, exercises that we do in our culture that worship demons. And he's saying, I don't want you involved in those customs. You are my people. I have set you apart to be my people, and I want you to follow my leading and be obedient to what I'm doing, and I will prosper you. There's a question on here. Do we know why God chose the Levites for serving and protecting the tent of meeting? That's a great question. I don't know. I know Levi was the one that God selected. He actually said to Joseph, I'm going to give you a double portion in order to cover Levi. Later, if you notice in Numbers, which is an interesting thing because it's a great question talking about the Levites would serve, the men of the Levites would serve as the redemption actually for the firstborns of the rest of the nations. In Numbers chapter 1, you see, or chapter 2, I'm sorry, you see the camps. Actually, it's Numbers chapter 3. It said that there were 7,500 in the west camp, 8,600 in the firstborns, in the south 6,200. That's in the camps. Of the firstborn, there were 22,273, and the Levites were redeemed that, and there were over 22,000 Levites. And for the number of firstborns, if you had a firstborn, it would need to be redeemed or given to serve in the temple. And what God was saying is the Levite men would redeem the men of all the other tribes so that families would not give their firstborn to serve. He said the Levites would serve. And you always need 1/10 of the firstborns, or the number of firstborns you have in your tribes, you need that many Levites serving in the temple. It was a form of a tithe that they would bring to God. And so I'm not sure why the Levites were chosen. I'm sure it's in there somewhere. I'm sure if you dig and search a little bit more, you'll find out what it is. But the Levites did not fight. They didn't go to battle. The Levites moved all of the tabernacle. Anyone else, all of the other tribes had to keep their distance away from the temple or the tabernacle, but the Levites would serve in it and around it and carry it and handle every detail of the tabernacle. And so out of the Levites is where we find the Pharisees and the Sadducees, where we find the priests that serve in the temple of God later. They had no allotted inheritance, but they did have land that would come to them through the offerings that would be given to the temple, and God would essentially take care of them. There's an argument, well, why do we pay pastors? And being a pastor, why are pastors being paid? Essentially, this was set up by God even back then, that the people would care for those who would serve in the temple, who would serve God's purposes. That's why they were financially being taken care of. I see another one. They asked the same question about he took them in place of the firstborn, but Levi was the third born son. Which is interesting that he would be taken. If you look back, here's something while you're looking at this, maybe someone can do this. I'll give you a little homework. Find out Levi was the third born son, but who is he the third born son to? I think I know the answer to this, but I want if somebody could run and check quick. Who was Levi the third born son? There were 4 women that Jacob had children with, the 2 concubines, and then his 2 wives, Leah and Rachel. Which one was Levi born to? So check that out. Come back. It's a great question. He isn't the firstborn, but God appointed him, and that's who would be the one to do that. I think even we read that back in Leviticus, actually, when he was talking about Levi, that he had set him apart. But I think Levi was even part of, at some point, doing something, and the other brother got punished, and Levi didn't get punished. He got appointed to take care of the tabernacle. So I don't know if it says it there. I don't remember it being there. I don't know the answer to that. In Numbers 2, why was the tribes arranged in a specific order around the tabernacle? What's interesting, I actually looked this up to see if somehow there was... Natasha
says
Leah. So Leah was the son of Leah, so the third son of Leah. So that's not even... it's a great question. No idea why they would be the one to redeem. The oldest was Reuben, and Reuben ends up being a tribe. We find that kind of did as Israel goes into this nation, these tribes start to get blurry as people are intermarrying. So then you see Israel. You see people of the tribe of, and the tribe of like Judah, which stays pretty pure to their tribe. The other ones kind of blend together. Some of them just kind of die off completely. Dan disappears. We don't even see Dan mentioned in Revelation. The tribe of Dan, which if you look at the size of Dan, is huge. It's 62,000, second only to Judah, which is 74,600. And then Dan disappears. It's not even in Revelation. But going back to Numbers 2, it really identifies God's sense of order. You had the camp of Judah, which had Judah, Zebulun, and Issachar in the east. You had the camp of Reuben, Simeon, and Gad in the south. It really doesn't tell us why they were there. It's something that you can go into and research, take a look at. You had the camp of Ephraim and the camp of Dan. And the camp of Dan, which is interesting because many believe there is an argument with Dan because he does disappear. He doesn't fulfill his assignment when he gets there. He's put in this place of leadership and then later doesn't fulfill his assignment. Dan moves from where he was allotted by God to be to a place he wanted to be. And there are many people who believe that Dan, who we see no reference to, who said would be the serpent that would bite at the heel of the horse, later we'll see this, that Dan actually, who is a sea-fearing people at some level, actually went out and spread to other places throughout Europe. And some believe that people in Germany would come from the root of Dan. Now, how crazy would that be if Dan, the tribe of Dan, was either at best or at worst, at least, mixed in with the Germans, But what if the tribe of Dan was actually a big part of the German culture, and it was the tribe of Dan that was actually doing to the Jewish people what happened in the Holocaust? That's the crazy place, and they track. And if a certain city called Danoi was the tribe of Dan, they've tracked it to that point. Then if they went to, if that's true, then they do indeed know that Dan went to Scandinavia and actually into Germany. So you want to keep your eye on Dan as we go through this, as he was one of the leaders.
I have a arrangement of how the camp was set up. You want to check out this picture?
Yeah, let's see
what it kind of looked like as far as the question that was about. Why was the camp arranged that way, or the arrangement of the camp in Numbers 2? You guys will see it on the screen, which is kind of interesting. You see Dan, Asher, Naphtali, Reuben, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and it's all surrounding the
tabernacle.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I've seen this picture before. It's a picture of a cross that's sitting there.
That's what I was wondering if there's any significance.
But there's been some pushback on this.
Mm-hmm.
We tend to take symbols that they didn't have then and impose them in the culture.
Yeah.
Many believe that they would have touched each other, that there wouldn't necessarily have been the gaps in between, like you see, that would have defined the cross, that it would have been more of a circular habitation and yeah. And that the smaller tribes would have been surrounded by the bigger tribes.
Yeah. It's an interesting picture. I think this might be a better.
Yeah, there it is. Michelle brought this up. It's great. She said Simeon and Levi were implements of violence because they slew men. Jacob said, let no my glory be united with their assembly during the blessing of his sons. Yeah, where Simeon is said that they're going to die off, and they don't die off, but you don't hear much about them. But Levi is then elevated. This was something that we talked about earlier, why that happened, why God chose Levi to do that after that. Jesse says, now Levi lived 137 years. It follows that Levi immigrated to Egypt when he was no more than 137 something and 80 to 57 years. Levi was the third son of Jacob and Leah. Yeah. So, yeah. I'm reading over some of this stuff. Jacob said, I will scatter them, let not my glory. Yeah, so Levi becomes a servant directly to God. I mean, this is a pretty big deal because they're touching God. That's something that I think we need to, maybe we'll discover as we're going through the Old Testament. Maybe we'll see the reason why Levi was selected for this. But one thing is for sure, God selected him. And he was the one that was the only one, him and the sons of Aaron were the only ones that were able to touch the tabernacle and to move the tabernacle and to handle it completely. And is something else that's interesting. If you look at Levi 21, I mean, there was a high standard held for these priests that they were not. They were only allowed to go to funerals for those closely related to them. Cleanliness was of the utmost importance. God literally set them apart from anything that would be unclean. And so when you're sitting in the New Testament reading about these religious leaders that put a premium on cleanliness and not touching the leper and not touching, when Jesus comes and shows up as a rabbi and he is touching the unclean, and you say the rabbi should have been doing this. That's a mistake I think we make. They're being obedient to the law that God gave them, and if you read this, you'd notice the death penalty was a common penalty for doing certain things here. Jesus came as a rabbi in the minds of the people there, and when he's touching the unclean, he is literally in their eyes, breaking the law. What they didn't know was he wasn't a rabbi. He was God making clean what was unclean. They didn't have the power to make clean what was unclean, and therefore the law told them you cannot touch what is unclean because the unclean will make you unclean. But in the case of Christ, he was he said, I'm living water. I remember when he goes to the woman at the well, and he says, if you knew who I was, you would ask for me to give you a drink because I'm a well of living water. Yeah. See, living water is water that cleanses. It's a cleansing water. It purifies. What Jesus was saying is, what I touch, I'm not made unclean by what I touch. I make clean what I touch.
Ooh,
and he opened the door to a new way of thinking for his believers. And in fact, he tells us that. He says, what the religious leaders, and we look down on them, we attack them for being religious, but they were just trying to do what God had told them to do. And God is saying, now I'm shifting now. What I was doing back then, now I'm doing a new thing. And I want you no longer to be made unclean by what you touch. I want you to start making clean the things that are unclean. That's why he takes the disciples up to Caesarea Philippi. And when he goes up to Caesarea Philippi, he says, listen, see all that? That's all unclean. We shouldn't even be here according to the law of the land. Like, we don't come to this place. In fact, Jesus, there's no reference of him going to into any Hellenistic or Greek or pagan city. He goes up to Caesarea Philippi, and as he's standing there, he's essentially saying, you're going to go into these places and you're going to bring life to them, and you're going to take places that are dead and you're going to make them alive. You're going to take things that are unclean, and when you touch them, they're going to become clean. Like, you're going to transform people's lives. And we see that. He says, you will forgive their sins. Like, you will go in and you will bring cleanness where there has only been uncleanness in the people's. It's a powerful calling that God's called us to, and so they didn't run from the leper. They didn't run from the person who is paralyzed on the temple. Peter said, silver and gold have we none, but what we have to make you clean and whole, we're going to give to you right now. We're not going to give you something to wallow in your brokenness, because we're not going to just love you in your brokenness. We're going to love you enough to set you free from that thing that's unclean, made you unclean. And we see this when you're looking through this. You can start to see that the Pharisees, as I'm reading this, at what point were the Pharisees to stop doing the law, when throughout the entire Old Testament, God is challenging them, you're far from me. Essentially, he did tell them, you're doing the law, but your heart is far from me. But don't we do that to some extent? Like, we can do all the Christian things, but our heart isn't with him. But these people were doing all of the things they were being told to do, and there was a lot of stuff to do. What other questions do we have out there in regard to this? I know it's an interesting passage. Heavy. When we go through this, you can look at the fighting men and kind of see the influence of the tribes. You better believe that the number of fighting men these tribes had determined influence in Israel, and the influence they had in the decision-making of Israel. He talks in Leviticus 27 about the things dedicated to the Lord. The tithe belongs to the Lord. One of the things you're going to see in these passages is first fruit, firstborn. That God says the first fruit in Leviticus 23 was his, and Leviticus 27, he says the firstborn is his. And that it was important to recognize that we don't give our first fruits, we don't give our firstborn to the Lord we bring them to the Lord because they're his. He said, this is mine. You don't determine how it's used. You don't determine what happens with it. And I've heard people say, well, I'm not taking it to the church because I don't know what they'll do with it. Well, it's not your decision because it didn't belong to you. And if you think that it would be misused, you should find a new church where you don't think that's the case. But it isn't your choice because it is not yours. It's not yours to defend. It's not yours to justify. It's not yours. The only thing that you'll give an account for is what you did with what belonged to God. And that's his first fruit and firstborn and everything. And we see that in Numbers. Everything that was first. You sell your house, it's the first of increase. It's the first of increase. If something comes in, it's the first of increase. You pay a tithe on that, or the first fruit or firstborn of that. And I know people have a hard time with that, but you don't get mad at me. It's in Leviticus. It's what set the scene. It was before the law. It's after the law. We don't give God our leftovers. God isn't making leftovers. And in fact, you know what was interesting? When you're reading Leviticus, it says, of all of the offering that's given, eat all of it, and whatever is left should be burnt that day. You don't save it till tomorrow because God doesn't do leftovers. He's God, and we put him first. We make him a priority and put him in first in that. You also see throughout Leviticus continuing the theme of the Sabbath rest and how important having a Sabbath rest. Here's a question for you. Why do you think that so many people resist the idea of a Sabbath rest? Pagans didn't take a day off. It was every they work. Why is it that people in general resist a Sabbath? They resist taking a Sabbath. The Israelites didn't Sabbath. They were supposed to Sabbath even their land in this, and when they were sent into captivity, they were sent into captivity a year for every time they didn't Sabbath their land. For every seventh year they didn't Sabbath their land, they went into captivity for. So of the 700 years that they were in the land, God put them into captivity for 70 years in order to Sabbath their land. I don't know where I come. I think when we don't Sabbath, our physical bodies are affected. I think physically people are often put into place to Sabbath, to take a time of Sabbath, that you need to rest. And people say, well, now that we're believers, we don't need the Sabbath. I just don't think that was God's original plan. He told us in creation, Sabbath is a creational principle. It's before the law. The law basically just affirmed what was a creational principle and said, remember the Sabbath. This is from creation. Christ didn't say we should no longer live honoring the Sabbath. It should be a part of our life. You may be saved and you're not going to hell, but I think it's important to remember the Sabbath, to continue. So why is it that we struggle so much with that and giving that day to the Lord and just having rest and taking rest in it? It's a big deal in the Old Testament. In fact, when mentioned why were they put into captivity, really two things come up. Number one, they didn't honor their parents and they didn't remember the Sabbath. They weren't Sabbathing the land, and which was every seventh year, and they weren't Sabbathing themselves. And by the way, the Feast of Booths, which is the Feast of Tabernacles, is brought up at this point. The feast really identifies the coming of the Lord. That feast, the coming of the Lord, we would say the second coming of the Lord as well. We believe that's happening. That's introduced to us in Leviticus 23. And they talk about booths and remembering when they left Egypt that they lived in booths or tabernacles. And so they're supposed to celebrate that from generation to generation. And then there's one other thing that comes up here that we're going to talk about a little bit, and that's Jubilee. And the Jubilee is an interesting concept that is hard to comprehend, and our culture today. Jubilee, and I'm trying to find it here where it's written out. Oh, here it is in 25. Yeah, Leviticus 25. If you go to Leviticus 25, we'll look at it, because Jubilee, once it's mentioned in 25, you see it again and again in this. You've probably heard by now people preach on Jubilee. Jubilee is not every 7th year. It's about the 50th year is the year of Jubilee. So it essentially, so you have 7 years times 7, which is 49, and in the 50th year it was this year of Jubilee. It says, count off 7 Sabbaths of years, 7 times 7 years, so that the 7th Sabbaths of years amounts to a period of 49 years. Then have the trumpet sounded everywhere on the 10th day of the 7th month, on the Day of Atonement. Sound the trumpet throughout your land, consecrate the 50th year, and proclaim liberty throughout the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you. Each one of you is to return to his family's property, each to his own clan. The 50th year shall be a jubilee for you. Do not sow and do not reap what grows of itself, or harvest the unintended vines, for it is a jubilee and is to be holy for you. Eat only what is taken directly from the field. In this year of jubilee, everyone is to return to his own property. And it goes on and talks about more of what you're supposed to do. Essentially, it carries on this idea that in the 7th year, you may say, well, in the 7th year, if they're not supposed to work the field, if they're supposed to Sabbath the field, then where does the food come from? Essentially, what God says is, it's in the 7th year that I'm going to provide for you from your fields, that you will work the 6th year, and in the 7th year, I'm going to provide for everything you need in that year. So you take a year of rest. When the Israelites were in the wilderness, they were not to collect manna on the seventh day. So they were to collect double on the 6th, and the manna would last through the 7th. What's interesting, in the year of Jubilee, in the Sabbath year of your fields, he said, do not plant in your fields in the 7th year, but eat only of the fruit in your field that has happened in your field without you working it. And the reason they weren't Sabbathing was because they were afraid that they would be left without food, because they didn't trust that God would provide the food they needed in the Sabbath. I think we have to, the Sabbath, there's something about the Sabbath in which we take this time off to rest, to celebrate, to enjoy, and to recognize that God is our provider, that he provides for us. And he provides for the Israelites in this 50th year, this year of Jubilee. He provides for them this redemption of all things. So if they're in debt, if they were slaves because they sold themselves into slavery, in the year of Jubilee, they were redeemed. Every debt was redeemed.
Jesse Kaplan says, but if, he's referring, this is the preface, the question he's asking, but if the transgression means riches for the world and their loss riches for the Gentiles, how much greater riches will be their full inclusion? He asks, what would the result of Jewish people coming to belief in and recognition of Jesus as their Savior, what would it be for the world?
Yeah, I don't understand the question. Explain that again.
So the Jews obviously reject their Messiah.
Right.
So if the scripture in Romans says, but if transgression means riches for the world and their loss, referring to the Jews, riches for the Gentiles, how much greater riches will their full inclusion be? That if the gospel has come to the Gentiles because of the rejection of the people of Israel, what would their full inclusion mean in reference to that? If the Jews come back to the knowledge of their Messiah and follow the Lord, What would that mean for the
Well,
world?
the Bible says that many of them will come back to the Messiah and recognize him as the Messiah of the Lord, and that they will come to him. I think they are considered to be God's people, as we referred to him as the nation that he chose. I do believe we were engrafted in the vine of Abraham.
Yeah.
So to continue to look at us as Gentiles coming to salvation would deny the truth that we are not also a part of the nation of Israel. Even though we may not be Jewish, we are a part of the same inheritance that they will have, in that they're just not accepting it. That's a great, pretty in-depth discussion, and I'd have to understand the question even more. Something Michelle brought up too would, why do we have our Sabbath on Sunday, the first day of the week, rather than on the Saturday, the seventh day of the week? This is a great question, Michelle, because there's a lot of people who go to church on Saturday, and that's the Sabbath, because the Sabbath is the seventh day. But we worship actually on Sunday, and we go to church on Sunday because it's the first day of the week, and we give the first day of the week to the Lord, because he gets the first. So essentially the Sabbath, how I would say it, if you want to live ideally or religiously to this, is your Saturday is the Sabbath. You are to take a day of rest. You are to enjoy the blessings of what God has done, and not try to extend your work weeks in order to make more money and to do more things, but enjoy that Sabbath and to have a day of rest. Sunday is to be the day we give to the Lord. It's actually to be set aside for the work of the Lord. What we have done in our culture today is we have combined the Sabbath and the Lord's Day into the same day on Sunday. So essentially the Sabbath is Saturday and we work. So then we go to church on Sunday and we give him the morning, and then we Sabbath the rest of the day. So essentially I'm going to do what's enjoyable. I'm going to instead of taking the 2 days off, we're just going to do one. And the reason the church has put it on Sunday, and this has been the fact that when you read in the New Testament about the Judaizers, and some of the people, the synagogue would meet on Sabbath. They would come together on Sabbath, and the church began doing that. But when Paul and other people would go out, they would meet on Sabbath, but then the church would gather on Sundays. And it's really started believing that it was the first day of the week. Let's give the first to God. And then we'll go, once we give the first, he will take care of the rest. So it's kind of like a tithe of our week, which is why, and it was really supposed to be a day that we completely gave to God. That was a total day that we gave to him. And that's where it began. So hopefully that answered your question. Jesse's got a bunch of questions. Is there an anticipated special blessing when Jewish heritage come into the faith? I don't know. I'm not sure about that. I think for sure they're returning. There's like God made a covenant with the Jewish people. You see a blessing on their life that many Jewish people deny, that they don't even believe is there. I've talked to many Jewish people that just don't believe any of that. There are a number of atheist Jews that are out there. I don't believe in this latter rain movement that we are now Israel and the Jewish people have no influence or importance at all. I think there is influence for that. But is there an anticipated special blessing when Jewish heritage come into the faith? I don't know that there's a special blessing other than the fact that they have an understanding of some things from the Old Testament that bring new light to a lot of the things in the New Testament that we might not believe. I keep bringing up the churches in Revelation, and a big part of that is because I'm studying it right now. When these missionaries would go from Israel into these pagan cultures, they were dealing with people who were Jewish people within the pagan culture and then just pure pagans and God-fearers. So you're bringing a gospel to three completely different backgrounds. You have this religion of Judaism, which has an understanding of what a lot of these missionaries were brought up in and understood. And then you're speaking to pagans who have no point of reference for anything in the Old Testament at all. And then you have God-fearers that know there's a God, but maybe have a different perspective of who he is. They know he's there. They maybe have had revelation of him. Maybe they've had some truth that they've seen in the Jewish, but they become God-fearers. And they're talking to all three of them as they're there. Any other questions? I don't know about you, but when it comes to the Sabbath, I enjoy my Sabbath. I enjoy
Amen.
taking time off. I enjoy the Lord's Day. I think the American culture, really Christianity, anybody who says this country wasn't founded on Christian principles would be foolish, because the reason we have a 2-day weekend, which many people have adopted around the world, is because of this idea of a Sabbath, and the first day of the week is the Lord's. And many people went to church on Sunday, even though they may not have been believers. They went to church, and it just became part of our culture. Otherwise, in the pagan culture, you worked every day. There was no day you took off. That's why festivals were such a big deal. I really would do this. If you're listening, I'm not trying to be offensive, but I really would encourage you to consider, as we're going through this, God does not like activities that were designed to worship demons that we somehow say, well, I'm going to do it, but I'm a Christian and I'm not going to think. So like things like, I'm not trying to be rude or mean, but like yoga, which is Hindu worship. When Christians participate in that, that is exactly what they were doing in the church in Pergamum. They were trying, in Thyatira, they were trying to be part of the culture and the benefits of and they justified why it was okay to worship demons. And Christ shows up and he says, this I have against you. You're participating in the ways of Jezebel, and you're in these temples. And when you study the culture, what they were doing is they were trying to justify why they were going into the temples to be a part of something they thought. And when you see this, God's saying, I don't want you to be involved in the practices of Egypt, and I don't want you to be involved in the practices of Canaan. I have a kingdom, and I want you to find your identity in the kingdom of God. And there are things in our culture that are fine, but there are some things that appear to be fine that are not fine. And even the more I study and I get into it, like you see the horror films that are out there that literally glorify demons, that glorify fear. You see Halloween and how demonic it has become. You see these websites that are opening ourselves up to things that are demonic and Wicca and forms of power. It's so important that you research activities that the world is saying is amazing and know their roots, so you know what you're participating in, because ignorance is not bliss. Ignorance can get you in some serious trouble if you're not following up and trying to figure out what's going on. And I think God is wanting to guard us from these subtle demonic things that are just trying to get our heart. So I think we're coming up on the conclusion of this. Any other questions that you may have that you would guard your heart against? And I know that there's a lot of people that aren't going to like what I said, especially, I know it is. I think we're in a culture that even our young people are looking at and they're saying, well, let's just be tolerant. Let's just accept. And God's like, no, tolerant to what? Tolerant to demons. And what do demons do? They come to kill, steal, and destroy. So if we're going to be tolerant to things that are destructive, what we're doing is saying it's okay that he's killing you. It's okay that he's destroying your life. We're not tolerant. It's not about being tolerant to people. It's about being tolerant of deeds that are killing people. It's like we did a podcast earlier today. It's like being tolerant of cancer. Let's just be tolerant to cancer. It'll be too offensive to tell them they should get help or prayer, or we should introduce medicine to help them or do any of that. Let's just be tolerant. No, we hate cancer because we love the person. People say, well, you can't hate, you hate people. No, because of what they do. No, we hate the deed because we love the person. We love the person and we hate what the deed is doing to the person. And that's essentially what's going on here. God says, these are the deeds that bring destruction, and these are the deeds that bring life. We don't hate people. Yes, Easter did. In fact, the idea of a lot of like Christmas originated from a pagan, and Natasha's bringing this up. Christmas and Easter, both. Easter is a pagan word. What has happened is with Passover being right there, Easter is probably easier to swallow. Well, it's more conducive to what we're talking about because Easter coincides with the death and resurrection. The idea of Easter and the Easter bunny, all that's pagan. The idea of celebrating the resurrection of Christ, that is not demonic. So, the word Easter, we use the word Easter, but we're really celebrating the resurrection and death of Christ. And it was at this period of time when he was crucified would have been at Passover, which is during this time, which makes more sense. And it's not like you're in a pagan holiday when you're celebrating. It would not be seen that way. The thing that's going to bother some people, and we celebrate it, is Christmas. Jesus wasn't born at that time. In fact, much of and we've talked about this last Christmas Eve, much of the storyline, the history that we believe about Christmas is different than what we've been told. The characters are there, but the timeline is a little different. How it happened is a little different. The way it looked was a little different, and it was all packaged at this time of gift giving. And so the birth of Christ, although it was celebrated all year long, the church, and this holiday isn't very long. Christmas itself, the birth of Christ, the celebration of the birth of Christ, which I don't have a problem with. Celebrating the birth of Christ, don't have a problem with. But the reason they did it was so many believers, and I think the Quakers, the Puritans, that did not celebrate Christmas, started celebrating Christmas because so many of their people wanted to do the gift-giving thing. And so they adopted the gift-giving thing in this holiday that would be about the birth of Christ. So, and then we've said, Christ was the greatest gift, and that's why we give gifts, and we all love gifts, and we love that type of thing. It had pagan roots, but not every, like the 4th of July is a holiday that doesn't have pagan roots. It has national identity roots, and which happens to be my favorite holiday is the 4th of July. But like Halloween, so there's this in-between ground with Christmas, and then you have Halloween where there is no in-between ground. And Christians will go all out in this thing and almost seem no conscious about it at all. And I think you have to guard your heart because it just, and there are many believers, when you hear this, I know what's going to happen. You're going to hear this and you're just getting radical. You're getting crazy. You're legalistic. I mean, they're going to come up with it because you aren't going to take away something that I like. And you read in Revelation, you read the rebukes of Christ to the church in Revelation. He goes right after some of the things and beliefs that they have that I'm sure wouldn't be able to be easy to change in their church. So yeah, and you'll see people like Memorial Day, we honor those who have fallen, and Labor Day, we honor the fact that we worked and it's a day off. President's Day, there's a lot of things that I wouldn't say are demonic that we just celebrate. Holidays are not, or days we take off aren't necessarily holy days, holidays. But there's some celebrations and festivals that we should not be participating in. Any other questions you have? I'm sure there will be plenty of feedback as people listen to this, and some good, some maybe a little frustrated with me because I've touched on a few things that are pretty sensitive for people. I'm not saying go out and stop doing Christmas. What I'm saying, you should consider it. You should pray about it. My family, we do Christmas. We do Christmas Eve. We celebrate the birth of Christ. We also celebrate my wife's birthday, which is on the 25th of December. And I actually moved it because nobody would think about her on her birthday. So I moved it to the December 26th. We're going to celebrate her that day. Any other questions you have? I think something you could look into more, and I would encourage you to do that with, is Jubilee. Check it out. See God's economy and how he handles Jubilee, the benefit of Jubilee, why God would do that. It's really kingdom mindset on earth in this. And then the other thing, look at Leviticus 26. God's heart is just revealed there. He's like, I want to bless you. I want you to experience the blessings that are there. There's abundance there. And he says, all I want you to be is, if you obey me, make me your God. If you will be my people, and I will be your God. If you will be my people, I will be your God. I will provide. 5 of you will chase hundreds. I will look upon you with favor, make you fruitful, increase your number, abundance for more than you will need. You will never be in want. I will prosper you. The bars will be broken that were yokes against you. I mean, he's just literally letting them know that he's going to bless them if they just obey him. I just love that. I think that's an incredible motivation to follow what God is saying and be obedient to it.
Amen.
So let's go into Numbers. We're going to be starting in Numbers chapter 3 and Numbers chapter 4, and we'll be going into that and kind of entering a different level, a different type of book than Leviticus. And then we'll come back next Wednesday. We'll talk about it a little bit more.